So here's just the brief agenda for the day. We'll actually start off by talking a little bit about the global and regional overview, because certainly a lot of those factors matter for India's own macroeconomic outlook, which we'll then get into. We'll also touch upon the different sectors, because of course we understand that we have a wide-ranging audience joining us today. And so we do want to make sure we touch upon the consumer, industrial, as well as government outlook. Like you mentioned, we love to keep these sessions interactive, get lots of audience questions, and so we'll leave some time for that, and then end off with a few key takeaways as well as suggested actions. So let's dive right into it. Let's talk about what's happening around the globe, and then align on just what that means for Asia Pacific's outlook. So from a global perspective, we've been talking about this for a while, and it really looks like the key drivers of global macroeconomic growth has remained unchanged broadly. The trajectories look quite a bit different. So the first one there, from a key drivers perspective, is just looking at what's going on with Europe's overall energy supply situation. Of course, from a Russia-Ukraine war perspective, there has been a lot of crunch on that commodity supply. But of course, some of that positive news coming through just as a result of warmer weather that we saw during this past winter. Number two is looking at the US Federal Reserve's actions. Certainly, all eyes on the US Fed every single month when they come out with their monetary policy. They continue to be quite hawkish, and this does have wide-ranging implications from an interest rate perspective and a cost perspective for the globe, and certainly for Asia Pacific. And then finally, on a positive news, you've got China's sudden reopening as of December of last year. This has certainly changed the trajectory, not just of that market, but has wide-ranging impacts for the overall Asia-Pacific outlook as well. So in terms of the impact of a lot of these different key drivers, we've basically got an expectation of growth slowdowns in Europe as well as the US, but then happily an acceleration of growth in China. You've, of course, got an environment of higher interest rates that we'll be touching upon later in the session, and then also a broader expectation of elevated costs. These have a few different impacts from an Asia-Pacific perspective. So, of course, from a growth outlook point of view, you actually have a perspective of a mixed impact on emerging market growth, and I'll explain a little bit about what I mean by that. Of course, from a US Federal Reserve action perspective, you also have an expectation of broad-ranging currency depreciations across markets, and then also an expectation of those elevated costs coming through from the food and fuel price perspective, but also a whole range of other commodities as well. So let's actually put into numbers the qualitative outlook that I just laid out. So here are a lot of our real GDP forecasts for a lot of the major Asia-Pacific markets that we cover for 2022 and 2023. What the audience will notice right off the bat is that for most of the Asia-Pacific markets, 2023 is going to be a year of slower growth compared to 2022, with, of course, one glaring exception being China on that front. But another thing that companies would, or the audience will notice, is that you do have a few bright spots still in the region that companies may want to capitalize on. And certainly one of the bright spots is the market that we'll be talking about today, which is India, which has actually seen one of the highest growth rates in 2022 and is likely to come out at, again, one of the highest growth rates in 2023 as well. So I actually want to talk about, or blow up that number a little bit, slice and dice it in different ways, and really talk about where some of that growth is coming from, what that broader medium-term outlook looks like. And so certainly what you'll notice, the first thing here is we've included a couple of the other major components that go into that broader GDP number, that headline GDP number that everyone tends to look at. We're basically looking at it from an investment and a consumer spending lens. And what you'll notice really here is, broadly speaking, investment as well as consumer spending both contribute to roughly similar amounts or have similar contributions to that overall growth number. The second thing that you'll notice here is that 2023 actually looks like a little bit of a valley between some of the higher growth rates that we saw back in 2022, as well as the broader normalization or pre-pandemic expectations of growth that you're likely to see moving on to 2024 and 2025. So in other words, basically what you're going to see is a lot of the global headwinds that we just talked about having maximum impact or downside impact on that 2023 number. But then as we move into that medium-term outlook, you are likely to see some of those growth rates come back to that average of about 7% from a GDP perspective, but then certainly also some of the components there.
Kinnari, if I could just jump in here briefly, you mentioned that consumer spending, investment, government spending will have roughly equal contributions in India's overall growth story. Are there any sub-segments or sectors that you'd point to that are likely to be more resilient or fast growing this year?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a few sub-segments within the investment and consumer spending components here. So specifically, I would call out public investment, and we'll certainly get into it as it relates to some of the government announcements that came through in the budget that was recently passed. So that's number one. If you want to look at a sub-segment within investment, it's that public investment, which we're really seeing drive some of those growth numbers. And then secondly, you're looking at consumer spending from a higher income consumers. Those are the ones that are likely to be most resilient, particularly in 2023, where you're still seeing some of those inflationary pressures. You're still seeing some of those global headwinds weigh on broader consumer spending. But then there's also another way of looking at the economy, which is looking at it from a gross value added by some of the different sectors. And there are certainly some bright spots that we can point to across some of these different sectors as well. So before we just get into that, I just want to explain what's going on with some of these different lines that you see on the slide here. Basically, what we've done is we've tried to normalize and make this into an index. So we've assumed that back in 2019, as a 2019 pre-pandemic average level, all of the different sectors that you see here contributed a level of 100 to overall economic growth. What we've then done is we've tried to assess which are some of those sectors that are relatively more resilient than some of the others, have higher growth levels compared to that pre-pandemic baseline. So there are a few bright spots that we can point to here as well. I would specifically call out the manufacturing and construction sectors, which is in that dark blue and dark green line. Those two have really been resilient despite the fact that we have had 2 years of tremendous volatility in the market. Those are the two that you will broadly see have come up above that level of 100 through the last several quarters, likely to pretty much remain at that level and relatively better than some of the other sectors that you see on the slide here. The other sector that I would roughly point to is also that trade, transport, and hotel sector, which of course, because of the pandemic, had a couple of weak years. But most recently, so we have seen that as the festive season approaches, certainly the Q4 number is likely to come up at quite a strong level. So that I would also name as one of the emerging bright spots in the overall economy for the audience and the companies that are oriented towards those sectors of trade and tourism, etc.
Hi, my name is Krista Reganey, and I'm Marketing Director here at FrontierView. I'd like to thank you for watching a segment of this webinar. If you'd like access to the full video and our latest insights, data, and research, sign up for a free trial with us today. Simply scan the QR code on the screen.